London, winter of 1817. The city trembled beneath a pall of fog and the scent of coal smoke. Carriages rattled across slick cobblestones, their lanterns flickering like ghosts in the mist. Inside a modest schoolroom at the edge of Bloomsbury, Miss Eleanor Harcourt stood before a table strewn with papers she would never mark again. Her dismissal letter, folded neatly beside a stack of lesson plans, bore the headmaster's seal and the weight of whispered scandal. Unbecoming conduct, it read, 3 words that unraveled what little she possessed of safety or dignity. The accusation was untrue, but truth rarely carried currency among those who thrived on gossip. A student's misplaced admiration had been enough to stain her name. Now, at 27, the daughter of a disgraced clergyman found herself untethered from both reputation and livelihood. She folded the letter with steady hands, though her heart trembled. Outside, the snow fell in thin, hesitant threads, coating the iron railings in pale lace. Her reflection in the window looked older than she remembered, eyes ringed with fatigue, hair drawn back too tightly, posture too upright, as if dignity alone might shield her from ruin. When the school matron entered to retrieve her keys, neither woman spoke. There were no farewells for those quietly dismissed. That evening, Eleanor's lodging house was silent save for the crackle of the hearth. She sat beside her small trunk, reading the only letter that offered her a future, though even that was uncertain. It came from the office of Lord Ravenshire, Duke of Whitmore, whose estate lay deep in the Somersetshire countryside. A governess was required for his twin sons, 8 years of age and, according to the note, in need of severe discipline. The post had remained vacant through a series of resignations. The salary was generous, but few women cared to endure what others had fled. Eleanor stared at the wax seal, fingers tracing its crest, a raven in flight, and told herself that exile in the country was preferable to disgrace in London. 2 days later, the mail coach rattled westward through frostbitten fields. Eleanor's gloved hands clutched the strap of her reticule as the driver's whip cracked through the fog. Each mile carried her farther from the murmurs of the city and deeper into a landscape of silence. By dusk, the coach turned up a long, winding drive bordered by black oaks and frozen fountains. Ravenshire appeared from the mist like a fortress, its stone facade streaked with age, its windows dimmed beneath heavy drapery. No warmth greeted her, only the echo of hooves and the weight of expectation. The butler who received her was tall, grave, and unsurprised. "Miss Harcourt, His Grace awaits you in the study." She followed him through corridors lined with portraits whose painted eyes seemed to track her progress. Dust motes hung in the air like suspended breath. The faint scent of lavender lingered, remnant of a woman's presence, long faded. The Duke of Whitmore rose when she entered. He was a man carved by restraint, broad-shouldered, impeccably dressed in black, his expression a mask of composure. Only the faint silver at his temples betrayed his years. "Miss Harcourt," he said, voice low measured, "you have come highly recommended, though I question whether your references understood the nature of this household." His gaze lingered a fraction too long, as if assessing her endurance rather than her merit. "I'm accustomed to difficult children, Your Grace," she replied, her tone respectful but firm. "They're seldom as dreadful as rumor would make them." He inclined his head slightly, a gesture neither approval nor dismissal. "You'll find my sons spirited. I require order, not indulgence. Their tutors have failed for lack of resolve. I shall endeavor not to add my name to that list." A faint flicker, perhaps amusement, perhaps surprise, touched his eyes before vanishing. "Dinner is served at 7. You will dine separately with the boys. Mrs. Blackwell, the housekeeper, will show you your quarters." She curtsied, feeling the dismissal. As she turned to go, he added quietly, "Discipline, Miss Harcourt, not sentiment." The warning followed her into the corridor like a chill draft. Mrs. Blackwell, a stern woman with an iron bun and eyes that missed nothing, led her up 2 flights of stairs to a narrow room overlooking the east garden. The chamber was clean but cold, its furniture plain oak. The late Duchess preferred warmth, Mrs. Blackwell remarked, lighting a taper. His Grace does not. She handed Eleanor a key and left without further comment. When the dinner bell rang, Eleanor descended to the schoolroom where two boys sat slouched at the table, their identical faces marked by mischief. "You're the new one," said the elder twin, Henry, with a smirk. His brother, James, released a frog from his pocket. It landed squarely on her open book. The boys burst into laughter. Eleanor closed the book gently, meeting their gaze without anger. "Then let us begin with introductions. I'm Miss Harcourt. That creature, I presume, is your first lesson in manners." Their laughter faltered, replaced by curiosity. She caught the frog carefully and carried it to the open window, releasing it into the night. "All living things deserve gentleness," she said softly, "even those we find disagreeable." The Duke, standing unseen at the doorway, observed the exchange. Something unreadable flickered across his face before he withdrew. Later, as Eleanor retired to her room, she found the fire unlit and her hands too cold to hold the candle steady. She thought of the Duke, his voice, the lifeless calm of his eyes, and wondered what grief could hollow a man so entirely. Through the thin walls came the distant sound of laughter, the twins chasing each other down the corridor. For the first time in years, that echo carried a note of warmth within Ravenshire's walls. She unpinned her hair, brushing it by the dim light, when faint voices drifted from the hall. Two maids lingered outside her door, whispering. "She won't last a fortnight," one said. "The last 3 fled before Christmas." "And the Duke?" the other murmured. "Do you think he'll even notice her?" A pause, then a whisper softer still. "He hasn't noticed anyone since the Duchess died. They say his heart turned to stone the night she was buried." Eleanor set down her brush, listening until their footsteps faded. She drew the curtains and climbed into bed, the candlelight flickering across the frost-laced window pane. Somewhere in the distance, a clock struck 11. She closed her eyes, telling herself that courage was a form of faith, that perhaps within these cold halls, even a heart turned to stone might one day remember how to feel. But for now, Ravenshire slept, and so did its ghosts, waiting to see whether the new governess would survive the winter. The first days at Ravenshire passed beneath a veil of cold civility and silent observation. Miss Eleanor Harcourt, having unpacked her modest trunk in the governess's quarters, felt the weight of the estate's sorrow pressing upon her with each measured footstep. The corridors whispered with echoes of loss. The Duchess's laughter, they said, still lingered near the West Gallery, where her portrait hung draped in gauze. Servants spoke her name with reverence, as though her spirit might hear them. And at the center of this somber kingdom stood Alexander Whitmore, the Duke of Ravenshire, a man of discipline and restraint whose gaze could silence a room, yet betray nothing of the ache beneath his composure. Each morning, Eleanor found the Duke's twin sons, James and Charles, waiting in the schoolroom with the insolent smirks of boys too long ungoverned. The eldest by minutes, James was sharp-tongued and restless, while Charles hid behind a mask of charm that bordered on cruelty. They tested her patience at every turn. Ink spilled deliberately, lessons interrupted by mock bows and whispered imitations of her London accent. Yet she did not yield. "You may defy my lessons," she told them, voice calm but firm, "but you will not defy my purpose." The words carried through the air like a quiet vow. Her discipline was not of punishment, but of presence. She corrected them with patience, turned their mischief into instruction, and refused to let her dignity fracture under their laughter. Gradually, curiosity began to replace rebellion. By the 3rd week, the twins had ceased their pranks. James began to ask questions about her father's work as a clergyman, while Charles lingered after lessons, fascinated by her stories of London's carriages and gaslit squares. The servants noticed the change, whispering that the new governess had a rare talent for taming wild hearts. One afternoon, as snow gathered against the tall windows, the Duke himself entered the schoolroom unannounced. His presence filled the space, an austere figure in a dark waistcoat, his expression a mask of command. The boys stood instantly, their earlier defiance replaced by nervous respect. Eleanor rose, her hands clasped before her. "Continue," he said simply, gesturing toward her open book. She read aloud from Milton, her voice steady though her pulse quickened beneath his scrutiny. When she paused to explain a passage, the Duke's eyes softened almost imperceptibly, just a flicker, gone before she could believe it. Later that evening, Mrs. Hargreaves, the housekeeper, whispered in the servants' hall that His Grace had stood by the fire long after the lesson ended, saying nothing, merely staring into the flames. "He listens to her," she said. "Not just her words, her manner. The Duke listens as if he's remembering something he lost." The following week brought a formal dinner. Eleanor was not meant to attend. Governesses rarely dined with nobility, but the twins, in a fit of mischief-turned affection, refused to descend without her. Reluctantly, Alexander allowed it. She entered the grand dining hall, her simple gown of gray muslin stark against the glitter of silver and candlelight. Conversation paused. The Dowager Lady Whitmore, sharp-eyed and unforgiving, regarded her with thinly veiled disdain. "I see London sends us school-teachers who believe themselves fit for company," she murmured, loud enough for half the table to hear. A flush rose to Eleanor's cheeks, but before she could retreat, the Duke spoke. "Miss Harcourt has restored discipline to Ravenshire," he said evenly. "That is company enough." The words fell like a gauntlet upon the table. The Dowager's expression tightened, and the air shimmered with restrained discomfort. Yet in that moment, Eleanor saw something shift within Alexander's eyes, an acknowledgement, a defense he had not offered to anyone in years. Gratitude, perhaps, or something deeper, too fragile to name. That night, while extinguishing the candles in the library, she found him standing before the great window, moonlight silvering his profile. "You should not have had to endure that," he said quietly, not turning. "My mother forgets that decency does not depend on birth." She hesitated before replying, her voice low. "And I forget, Your Grace, that kindness does not depend on approval." He looked at her then, truly looked, as though her words had cracked some hidden wall within him. For a heartbeat, the distance between them dissolved. Just a man and a woman, both marked by loss, both struggling to keep their dignity intact. But propriety returned as swiftly as it had vanished. He inclined his head, murmured a brief good night, and left her to the silence. She stood alone, the scent of tobacco and candle smoke lingering like a memory she had no right to claim. The days that followed brought subtle changes. The Duke began to join the morning lessons more often, sometimes offering historical anecdotes to the boys, sometimes standing silently at the back of the room. When Eleanor played the pianoforte to accompany the children's recitations, he lingered longer than necessary. The music, soft and melancholy, seemed to stir something long dormant in him. Servants whispered that the Duke smiled once, a small, uncertain curve of the lips, as he watched Miss Harcourt correct his son's Latin. Yet beneath these quiet transformations ran a current of danger. Rumors began to swirl beyond the estate. Visitors from London gossiping about the widowed Duke's charming governess. Invitations to spring gatherings arrived, and with them, veiled warnings. A woman of her station, so close to a man of his, would be a subject of scandal. Eleanor knew it too well. But when the Duke thanked her one evening for bringing laughter back to Ravenshire, her heart betrayed her. "I fear it is your heart that allows it," she whispered before she could stop herself. He said nothing, yet his gaze lingered, long and searching, as though words might fracture the fragile peace between them. The firelight caught the faintest shimmer in his eyes, not grief this time, but something warmer, something perilous. Outside, the snow began to thaw, and with it, something within Ravenshire began to bloom again, slowly, quietly, like the first green shoot breaking through frost. Spring arrived at Ravenshire, as if the estate itself were awakening from years of mourning. The snow melted into rivers of light that flowed through the gardens, and the scent of lilacs drifted through the open windows. Yet for all the beauty that returned to the grounds, within the Duke's heart, there reigned a storm no gentler than the one that had driven him to solitude years before. Alexander Whitmore had grown accustomed to grief. It had become a part of his existence, steady and predictable. But the presence of Eleanor Harcourt disturbed that order. She brought warmth where he had built walls, music where there had been silence. And that frightened him more than loneliness ever had. He began to find reasons to see her, excuses so thin they almost shamed him. A question about the boys' Latin progress. A request for advice on their temperaments. A brief stop at the library, only to find her already there. Sometimes, when she thought herself unobserved, he would catch her humming softly as she arranged the children's books or paused to gaze at the portrait of the late Duchess. The melody would still the air around him. There was no comparison between them. His late wife, Helen, had been beauty and laughter personified, the darling of every ballroom. Eleanor, by contrast, was a quiet flame, unadorned and steady. Yet it was her calm that unnerved him most. One evening, he lingered near the schoolroom doorway and watched her helping Charles with his handwriting. The child, frustrated, had pressed too hard, tearing the page. Instead of scolding him, she took his small hand in hers and said gently, "Perfection is not demanded, Charles, only sincerity." The Duke turned away, struck by the tenderness of her voice. That night, for the first time in years, he dreamt, not of loss, but of laughter echoing through those long, lonely halls. The estate began to change under her influence. Servants who once moved like shadows now spoke in light tones. The twins, once terrors of every tutor, began to rise early, eager for their lessons. Even the Dowager Lady Whitmore could not deny the transformation, though she viewed it with deep suspicion. "The woman oversteps," she told her son coldly one morning. "You've allowed her far too much influence. This warmth will be mistaken for intimacy." Alexander said nothing at first. He stood before the window, hands clasped behind his back. "And what if it were?" he asked at last, his voice low. The dowager froze, scandalized. "You cannot mean, Alexander, she is a governess, the daughter of a disgraced clergyman. You would disgrace your title for the sake of sentiment." He turned, his gaze distant but resolute. "Perhaps sentiment is all that keeps us human." That night, Eleanor found herself summoned to the library. The fire had burned low, shadows flickering against shelves of forgotten volumes. The Duke stood near the hearth, his expression unreadable. "Miss Harcourt," he began, "my mother has spoken to me about appearances." She folded her hands. "I see. And you wish me to leave." The words caught in her throat before he could answer. He looked at her then, truly looked, and for a long moment said nothing. "I wish only that gossip would not rob this house of peace," he murmured finally. "But peace, it seems, has already been disturbed." She lowered her eyes. "If I have brought you discomfort, Your Grace, I shall resign my position at once." He took a step forward. "Discomfort," he echoed softly. "You bring—" He stopped, struggling for words. "You bring light to a place that has long forgotten what it means to feel alive." Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them, an understanding fragile as spun glass. For a moment, time seemed to still. Then a knock shattered it. Mrs. Hargreaves at the door, announcing that the Dowager required Miss Harcourt's attendance. Eleanor curtsied and withdrew, her pulse racing, the echo of his words burning in her mind. The next morning, the tension in the house was palpable. The Dowager, with cold precision, reminded the governess of her station, warning her that men of rank mistake gratitude for affection, and that she would do well to remember her place. Eleanor endured the rebuke in silence, her pride wounded but not broken. Yet when she returned to the schoolroom, her composure faltered. The Duke's sons noticed. "Miss Harcourt," James said hesitantly, "did father say something wrong?" She smiled faintly. "No, my dear. Some truths are simply difficult to bear." Days passed in strained civility. The Duke avoided her, and she, too proud to seek him out, poured herself into her work. But one afternoon, while supervising the twins in the garden, she saw him approaching across the lawn, his dark coat stirring in the breeze. Miss Harcourt, he called. The boys scattered toward the stables, leaving them alone among the budding rose bushes. I fear I owe you an apology, he said, stopping before her. I have allowed this house, myself, to become governed by fear. Fear of what society whispers, fear of what I might feel. She met his gaze, her voice barely above a whisper. And what do you feel, my lord? He hesitated, then reached into his coat and produced a small object, a pressed violet, fragile and faded, preserved between glass. It belonged to Helen, he said quietly. I thought I would never part with it. Yet when I saw you place fresh flowers in the children's room each morning, I realized something. Grief may linger, but it need not rule. Her breath caught. Why are you telling me this? Because, he said, his voice deepening, I find myself speaking to you as I once prayed I could speak to her, not as the Duke of Ravenshire, but as a man who has forgotten how to begin again. For a heartbeat, neither moved. The garden wind lifted a lock of her hair, and his hand, almost of its own accord, rose to still it. The touch was fleeting, chaste, yet charged with an ache neither dared name. A distant bell from the chapel broke the moment. He stepped back, his composure returning with visible effort. Forgive me, he murmured. It was unseemly. Unseemly, she said softly, perhaps, but not unkind. He bowed his head, his jaw tightening. If the world were not so cruelly ordered, Miss Harcourt. But it is, she finished for him, her tone calm but trembling. And we must live within it. He nodded once and walked away, his figure disappearing into the pale gold light. She stood long after he was gone, one hand resting over her heart. The pressed violet lay forgotten on the bench beside her, its fragile petals catching the wind. That evening, when the lamps were lit and the household retired, Eleanor sat by her window, watching the stars above Somersetshire. Below, in the darkened courtyard, the Duke crossed toward the stables alone, as he did every night to find solace in solitude. Yet when he paused and looked up, their eyes met across the distance. No words passed between them, only that silent recognition, dangerous and undeniable, that neither grief nor class could erase. The night carried their secret into the wind, and with it, the fragile beginning of something neither dared to hope for, yet both knew had already begun. The arrival of summer brought with it an unease that neither sunlight nor songbirds could dispel. The transformation of Ravenshire had not gone unnoticed by the world beyond its gates. Rumors now rode with every carriage that passed through Somersetshire, whispers of a widowed duke and the governess who had rekindled warmth in his grief-darkened halls. London society pages called it a most delicate scandal, and invitations to grand houses began arriving, not out of friendship but curiosity. The dowager read each one with silent fury before tearing them to shreds. Your indiscretion has made you a spectacle, she told her son coldly. If you do not send her away, Ravenshire will become the laughingstock of every drawing-room from Bath to Mayfair. Alexander listened, hands clasped behind his back, the very picture of restraint. It seems, he said quietly, that compassion has become an offense in this age. The dowager's eyes hardened. Do not mistake compassion for affection, Alexander. You grieve still. This woman merely fills a silence. Her words, precise and cruel, struck him harder than she knew. When she left, he remained alone by the window, the sound of distant laughter from the garden haunting him. It was Eleanor's laughter, soft, unguarded, and free. That evening, he found her in the schoolroom, helping Charles mend a broken kite. The child's hands were sticky with glue. Eleanor's sleeves bore the marks of his enthusiasm. She looked up when the Duke entered, her smile faltering as she read the tension in his face. Your Grace, she began, rising, is something amiss? He hesitated before answering. It seems my mother finds your presence here unsettling. Her expression did not change, but the light in her eyes dimmed. Then I should take my leave, she said quietly. I have no wish to bring dishonor upon your household. He stepped forward, his voice low. Is that truly your wish, Miss Harcourt? She met his gaze, her composure wavering. "It is not my wish," she said, "but it may be necessary." For a long moment they stood in silence, the tension between them heavy as the dusk gathering outside. Then he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Every day since you came here, I have felt myself returning to life. I'm no longer content to live among ghosts. Yet if your leaving restores peace to this house, I will not stand in your way." Her hands trembled as she folded the kite cloth. "You mistake kindness for courage, my lord. I am not brave enough to stay where I am not welcome." He wanted to tell her that she was wrong, that she was the bravest soul he had ever known, but the words would not come. Instead, he bowed slightly and left the room, his departure as silent as a wound unspoken. 2 days later, the first carriage arrived for the summer fete, an event the dowager insisted upon to restore propriety to Ravenshire's name. The estate swelled with guests, powdered ladies with diamond fans, gentlemen in satin waistcoats, and the ever-watchful eyes of gossip. Eleanor moved like a shadow among them, attending to the children, careful never to linger where the Duke might be seen speaking with her. But when she caught sight of him across the ballroom, tall, proud, the firelight reflecting off his signet ring, her heart betrayed her resolve. He crossed the floor toward her as though drawn by something beyond will. "You should not be here among these jackals," he murmured. "They do not see you." She smiled faintly, her voice steady despite the ache in her chest. "Nor must they, your grace. It is safer that way." He looked at her then, with the kind of longing a man dares only once in a lifetime. "Do you think safety is all I desire?" he asked quietly. Before she could answer, Lady Pembroke, one of the guests, swept toward them, her painted lips curving in mock delight. "Ah, the famous governess. How charming. I do hope, Miss Harcourt, you find the Duke's hospitality as accommodating as his admiration." The words hung like poison in the air. Laughter rippled faintly from the crowd. Eleanor's throat tightened, but she curtsied with perfect grace. "His grace has shown me nothing but respect, my lady, as has every true gentleman present." The subtle barb silenced the laughter, but not the shame burning behind Alexander's composed expression. Later that night, as the fete dwindled and the musicians packed their instruments, Eleanor stole away to the garden for air. The roses had bloomed in wild profusion, their scent heavy in the summer heat. She thought herself alone until she heard his voice behind her. "You defended me," he said softly, "when it should have been I defending you." She turned, her composure breaking at last. "What defense could there be, your grace? I am no one, a governess with a tarnished name and no family to shield her. They will always believe the worst of me." He stepped closer, his eyes searching hers. "Then let them believe what they will. I will not hide my regard any longer." Her breath caught, but before she could speak, he took her hand, carefully, reverently, as though it were something sacred. "You have given me back my sons, my home, and my peace," he said. "You have shown me what it is to live again. Tell me, Eleanor, can a man love twice in one lifetime?" Tears filled her eyes, bright as the stars overhead. "If the first love taught him sorrow," she whispered, "then perhaps the second may teach him grace." He drew her hand to his lips, the touch light as a prayer. "Then let it be so," he murmured. "Let grace begin tonight." They stood in silence, bound by a truth neither could now deny. But before dawn, fate intervened. The dowager, having overheard fragments of their encounter, wasted no time in summoning the household. "Miss Harcourt," she declared at breakfast, "will depart Ravenshire before sunset. Her influence here has caused enough ruin." The Duke rose, fury flashing in his eyes. "You will not dictate the affairs of my house, mother. You would defy your family, your name, your duty, for her," the dowager hissed. He looked across the table at Eleanor, pale but composed, and in that moment, all hesitation vanished. "Yes," he said simply, "for her." The room fell silent. The dowager's hand trembled upon her teacup, but she said nothing more. Eleanor, overwhelmed, could not speak. When the guests departed later that day, she found the Duke waiting in the garden, The same violet she had once left upon the bench now pressed between his fingers. "It survived," he said softly, "though I thought the wind had claimed it." She smiled faintly. "Some things endure, even when reason says they should not." He reached for her then, not as a duke claiming what society denied him, but as a man who had finally found his heart again. "Eleanor," he whispered, "stay, not as governess, but as the mistress of Ravenshire, if you will have me." For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, through tears and laughter both, she nodded. "I will, Alexander." And so, in the summer of 1818, the once grieving Duke of Ravenshire found redemption not in duty or lineage, but in love, the quiet, steadfast kind that dares to bloom even amid scandal. Beneath the ancient oaks and the whispers of a world that could not understand, two souls, long bound by sorrow, found courage and tenderness. As the bells of Somersetshire tolled in the distance, Ravenshire stood no longer as a monument to loss, but as a sanctuary reborn, its windows bright, its laughter restored, and its master no longer alone.